Good morning, everyone. This is it. The last AP World History new lesson of the year. After today, all we're doing is review. It's been a wonky year. It's been an interesting year, but I've said this before. Overall, I'm very proud of you guys. I think we're in a good position. I think that you guys are going to do well on the AP World History exam. Today's lesson is just wrapping up a bunch of loose ends that's associated with globalism. One of the things I want to emphasize about globalism is it was accelerated by the end of the Cold War. It was already happening during the Cold War, but once the Cold War ends, once that divide between East and West collapses, and that opens the door for more interactions between the East and the West. And then things like China opening itself up to the rest of the world. Globalism has really accelerated since 1991. So, globalism is our big thing. We're going to wrap up globalism today. So, here's just some basic things to know. I've touched on all of this on this slide today, but what I haven't done is put them very neatly in nice, clean categories for you. So I want to do this today. One of the things that College Board wants you to know is who are the political leaders in the 20th century who believe that government intervention in economics was part of the solution, and who are your free market capitalists? So examples of government officials who played a role in managing economies, especially in crisis: Franklin Delano Roosevelt in the USA during the Great Depression, Lenin and Stalin in the Soviet Union after World War One. Again, some of these people do great things. Some of them, like Stalin, and some of them are in the middle. Indira Gandhi, who was largely a socialist in India, who nationalizes important industries in India. That's an example of a government leader who gets involved in economic developments. In Hitler, after the Treaty of Versailles, he rebuilds the economy of Germany through remilitarization. Then you got your free market capitalists. An example of this would be Ronald Reagan. Ronald Reagan was a big proponent of free trade, low taxes, those very capitalistic ideals. Deng Xiaoping, the father of the Tiananmen Square massacre, but he was also the individual who opened China up to the rest of the world after the almost 40 years of the policies, actually more like 30 years of the policies of Mao Zedong. Deng is an economic liberal. That's the only thing he's a liberal about. He's not a political liberal. He's not a cultural liberal, but he was an economic liberal. All right. So, one of the things that College Board wants you to know is that in the 20th century, there's now been a next level of economic development. In period 3, the highest level of economic development you could achieve was to be an industrialized state. In period 4, some states have progressed even to that next level and have become what we call knowledge-based economies. You need to know this term. A knowledge-based economy is an economy that has evolved past an industrialization and focuses on providing services. It requires a highly educated, modern workforce with advanced infrastructure. Workers are required to be flexible and problem solvers. If you look at most of your parents, as a matter of fact, I don't think any of your parents probably, but at the very least, very few, work in some sort of industrialized plant making a manufactured good. Well, what do? They work at TSYS as part of the banking industry, where they have to be highly technologically advanced. They work at AFLAC, where they have to crunch numbers and provide insurance rates. It's a service-based economy, basically. I've made a living now for 20 years basically selling my knowledge. I'm not grinding away in a factory, which there's nothing wrong with that. But it's just, this is the next level. The fact that so many people in our society make their livings, and and one of the nice things about knowledge-based economies is wages are high in this, because you have an educated workforce that's required to solve problems. High wages tend to be key. The USA has one of the highest GDPs per capita in the world today, and we have 300 million people. So examples of knowledge-based economies, examples of countries whose economy have taken the next step. The United States, obviously. The second one that would really jump out to a lot of people would be Japan. Japan has an incredibly modern workforce. Yes, there's an industrial branch Japanese economy, just like there still is in the United States, but more and more you see them in the fields of knowledge-based economies. And a lot of this has to do with the rise of computers, internet industries, things of that nature, Silicon Valley. And also Finland is a good example of a knowledge-based economy. So here's the question. If places like the United States and Japan, and even to a lesser extent, Britain and Germany, which in period 3 were our industrial powers, have evolved into this next step of becoming knowledge-based economies, then the big question becomes, well, then where is the stuff made in the world? And by the end of period 4, not the start of period 4, start of period 4 is still made in those industrial powers. By the end of period 4, increasingly, you're going to see the rise of new industrialized states, in manufacturing shifts to those regions. Increasingly, industrial goods are manufactured in Asia and in Latin America. And these regions, this is an incredibly important point. I want you to make sure that you've paused to ponder what I'm about to say. And these new industrial powers in period 4 are going to have to deal with all the same stuff for good and for bad that industrialized powers dealt with in period 3. So Mexico has a huge environmental crisis with air pollution right now. They also have rising wages and changes to gender roles. So it's a mixed bag. Just like it was a mixed bag in period 3, it's a mixed bag in period 4. But Mexico is an example of a rising industrial power, mostly over the course of the last 40 years. Later on, I'll talk about a trade agreement that ended up leading to lots of industrialization heading to Mexico. And this is going to help Mexico's economy. It's going to change them socially. But again, all the stuff that industrialized states deal with, environmental costs, exploitation of labor, the whole shebang. Another example is Vietnam and China. You know, what percentage of the stuff you buy today says made in China? But understand this, China is still very much economically not as developed as those US, Finland, Japan, Germany, Britain. They are still primarily an industrial power. And again, Chinese industrialization in many ways is still in its infancy. It's really only 40 years old, where industrialization in China started to become a powerhouse. But this has led to a growing of the Chinese economy. With the rise in industrialization and manufacturing, and also going back all the way to things that we talked about earlier in this unit, the rise of new energy sources, there's a tremendous amount of goods being produced in the world, which means there's a tremendous amount of goods that need to be traded. You're going to see new institutions created in the 20th century that are designed to promote trade. New institutions will be created that promote free trade both internationally, and regionally. A couple of examples. The World Trade Organization. This is an international organization that has increasingly become powerful, I would say, since the end of the Cold War especially, whose goal is to promote free trade between states. Right now, there's over 100 member states. increasingly trade restrictions between states has declined over the course of the last, let's say, 40 years. That is an example of an international trade organization. An example of an interregional, which we don't really spend a lot of time talking about, intra-regional in one region, is NAFTA. NAFTA is the North American Free Trade Agreement. This was a free trade agreement signed in the early 1990s between the United States, Canada, and Mexico that created a free trade zone between these three countries with no trade restrictions, no tariffs. And ultimately, proponents of it have argued that it's benefited the economies of each of these three states enormously. One of the things that happened with NAFTA is lots of American businesses relocated to Mexico or relocated their industrial production. For example, Ford started building cars in Mexico. And there was a short-term loss of industrialization in the United States and jobs in those categories. But what happened was, now that more Mexicans have better paying jobs, they could start to afford higher end American goods like computers and cell phones and things of that nature. And the argument has been, and I think there's a lot of evidence to suggest this is true, that while the United States lost a lot of working class industrialized jobs that really hurt regions like Detroit, overall it created a lot more jobs and created the type of jobs that Americans want: high paying, knowledge based economy type jobs. Same thing for Canada. You may have heard of the European Union. The European Union is very similar to NAFTA, and that it is a free trade agreement between many of the states in Europe. And what makes them unique is they actually have their own currency. It's called the euro, where a bunch of different countries uses the same money as part of a free trade agreement. So in a lot of ways, they're even a bigger free trade agreement than the United States in NAFTA. But there's been some controversies with that, most interestingly, when a really important member of the EU, Britain, left it a couple of years ago. All right. One of the things that's happened with the end of the Cold War is culture has become more globalized. If you were to walk in downtown Tokyo or Beijing or Cairo or Moscow and you bumped into a teenager, there's a very, very, very high chance they're wearing blue jeans and sneakers, and they are eating a Big Mac and a Coca-Cola while listening to Eminem on their AirPods. Culture has become more universal, and lots of the culture that has spread has been Western culture, which has been very controversial, and that's one of the things that Al Qaeda in particular is against: the spread of Western culture at the expense of their values. But culture is becoming more universal, and this has been accentuated by the collapse of the Cold War. Art, entertainment, and pop culture reflect the influence of a globalized society. For example, K-pop in Korea has spread globally. I was watching TV and there was a commercial, and the artist in the commercial was a K-pop band who I have no idea who they were. This was an example of globalized culture. Facebook, Twitter, and even sporting events like the World Cup. The World Cup next year is going to be watched by something crazy like 4 billion people. So in a billion people in Asia and hundreds of millions of people in Africa and in America and in South America and Europe are all watching the same thing. That's an example of globalized culture. When everybody's on Facebook, when everyone's on Twitter, when everyone's listening to the same music or watching the same movies, that's example of globalized culture. And this has again been accentuated by the end of the Cold War. Consumer culture becomes globalized. You'll see global brands established that trade their goods internationally. For example, Coca-Cola. I have a hypothesis. I don't know that this hypothesis is true, but I'd like to know how close to true it is. I have a hypothesis that you can be pretty much anywhere in the world, say outside the Arctic and Antarctica, and you're never more than like 50 miles away from a Coca-Cola. That's how globalized Coke is. Coke is everywhere. Same thing for an automobile maker out of Japan like Toyota. You could probably find a Toyota car being driven by at least one person in every country in the world. I don't know that that's true, but it's got to be very, very, very close to the truth if it's not. I mean, again, this is an example of consumer culture becoming globalized. Now, in some places, there's active resistance to globalization. For example, the Chinese social media app called Weibo. China heavily censors outside news information. For example, Google is incredibly censored. If you want to have a good time and you're ever in China, try typing in the Tiananmen Square massacre and see what happens to you. Fun note, it won't pop up. Twitter is banned. Way too much free exchange of ideas. So the Chinese have created their own version of a social media app where they can heavily control and censor the material. And this is their way of trying to fight against outside ideas, like crazy ideas like humanitarianism and basic human rights. And maybe we shouldn't be locking up 2 million Uyghurs. Those ideas can't spread to their population. So that some places entities fight back. This is an example of that. Now, one thing that was created to help foster international cooperation occurred at the end of World War II. At the end of World War II, the world's leading powers looked at each other and said, should we try to bring back the League of Nations? And basically the answer was no. That was a disaster. The only point of it was to keep another global conflict from happening, and another global conflict happened. So after World War II, they shredded the League of Nations, and a new international organization designed to keep peace and foster cooperation amongst states was created by the victorious powers of World War II, and that entity is called the United Nations. Now, during the Cold War, the UN was only partially successful because one of the ways that the only ways that the Soviet Union would agree to join the UN, and also China, was if they had what was called the veto, the right to block anything they didn't like. Well, Britain, the United States, France were like, well, if they get the veto, we get the veto. So during the Cold War, anytime one side wanted something to get passed, oftentimes it got vetoed. But with the collapse of the Soviet Union, increasingly, the United Nations have been able to be successful in what its mission is. To me, the most important thing that came out of the United Nations was this. It was founded with the United Nations Universal Declaration of Human Rights, where all member states had to agree that all are created equal regardless of race. This is one of the founding problems of the League of Nations. There's a statement of equality, and member states are supposed, obviously not all states have adhered to this, protect the rights of women, children, and refugees, and not discriminate based upon race. These are humongous issues, and it's going to pave the way for a change in rights discourse that you hadn't seen before that. And this is something that was really lacking with the League of Nations in World War I. Now, ultimately, one of the really positive directions that's happened in the 20th century and in the early 21st century is this. Poverty globally has greatly declined. Lots of people have suggested that's as a result of the end of the Cold War and the spread of American ideals, both economic liberalism and political liberalism. Personally, I would tend to agree with that. If you were like Quattro earlier in this class, you sure were harsh on America. Yeah, I was harsh on the time where we were slave owners. Okay, I actually think personally we're living in the Pax Americana, the era of global peace, stability, and prosperity ushered in by the United States of America. I'm not saying we're perfect. I'm saying overall, I think it's inarguable, especially in the last 70 years, actually the last 100 years, that the United States has been an inarguable force for good. We tipped the balance of World War One. We tipped the balance of World War II. We spread economic liberalism. We spread political liberalism, and we stopped the spread of communism. America. And there's been a global era of relative peace, prosperity, and stability. Well, in my piece, I mean, well, I'm not saying we don't fight wars, but there hasn't been a war between two major world powers now since 1945. All the conflicts, by definition, you would identify as a smaller conflict. One of the things that has been also spreading is this idea of the spread of human rights. I would also suggest, what was the first state that had protection of human rights in its foundational document? It was the United States. So, again, very liberal ideas that I would argue in part started in the United States are spreading globally. In the 20th century and early 21st century, you've seen increases in female literacy and higher education. In the United States, more women will graduate with a college degree this year than men. Think about that. This has never been true. I mean, traditionally, in many societies, the only people who were literate were rich dudes. And now, this idea of literacy is important for everyone, not just men, but women as well, and access to higher education. All of these things are trending in the right direction globally, which doesn't mean there's not regions where this is a problem. And it doesn't mean that even places like the United States can't do better than this. It just means the overall trend is in the right direction. You see women gain the right to vote all over the world. United States, 1920, at the end of World War I, there's a constitutional amendment that grants women the vote. Japan, 1945, as part of their constitution that was created after World War II, at least partially by the United States, who was occupying Japan. Japan had to agree to give women the right to vote, and women have had the right to vote in this very patriarchal society ever since 1945. India gains the right to vote in 1947. Indian women gain the right to vote in the world's largest democracy when it is created. I told you a story earlier this year about Ataturk gave Turkish women the vote. So this is something that's happening globally. Democracies in the 20th and 21st centuries have increased the rights of women. Are we saying there's full equality globally? No. Are we even saying there's full equality in places like the United States? No. What we're saying is the trend is overwhelmingly in a good direction, and this idea of rights-based discourse globally has grown. Some other examples: the United States Civil Rights Act of 1965. This was a seminal moment in the Civil Rights Act of the United States. Martin Luther King Jr., this was one of the things that he really fought for, that really gave African Americans protection under American law that they hadn't really had. And since 1965, the rise in wealth and political power of African Americans in the United States has greatly increased, as many of the barriers that were created, especially in southern states, to hold African Americans down go away. South Africa will end apartheid. I didn't put the date here. I apologize for that. I think it's 1991. It's early 1990s. It might be very late 1980s. In South Africa, there was basically a caste system where the white minority controlled everything. Blacks couldn't vote, couldn't hold certain jobs. They lived in these terrible little shanty town villages, no running water. Meanwhile, the white populations of South Africa lived in modern cities, modern comfort. It's the harshest racial divide in the world in many ways in 1991. Outspoken black leaders like Nelson Mandela who had spoken against this in the early 70s had been thrown in prison. And Mandela spent 20 years in prison for speaking up for his people. Well, eventually, the ruling class ends apartheid. And it's not long after this that Nelson Mandela gets elected president of South Africa. And great changes take place in South African political, economic, and social systems. And remember, South Africa had originally been one of the settler colonies of Britain, so that's why they were, there was even whites there to start with. And again, I'm not even going to begin to argue that there's equality between whites and blacks in South Africa. That would be ludicrous. What I'm saying is it's at least trending in a much more positive direction than it was in 1991. And there has been more wealth by Africans in South Africa, and there has been increased political power, and they are acting in some ways like the majority now. And this is helping to facilitate South Africa's economic and political developments. You'll see environmentalism become a global movement. Organizations like Greenpeace are going to protest environmental consequences of new economic systems of global integration. And what's important is this is an international movement, which is why it's part of globalization. Earth Day would be an example of an environmental protest movement associated with globalization. This idea that if we all of us don't do something soon about the environment, we're all screwed. We're in this together. That's actually an example of globalization and global thought process and seeing things across international lines and taking a bigger picture viewpoint. Environmentalists from all over the world work in coordination now. That's part of globalism. So, what's our big themes with globalism? Increased trade, increased rights, increased discourse, opening ideas, opening this idea that everyone has rights. Largely, in many ways, brought in by American ideals at the very least. This is the direction the world's trending in. There's less poverty now in the world than there's ever been before per capita. Based on population, there's more rights, there's more freedoms. There's never been a better time in world history to be a woman. This is the era we live in. Will this continue, or will this global model collapse ultimately? Who knows? That's a question for the future that we'll be living our lives through. That was AP World History. 100 lessons, it turns out. Thought that was kind of a nice round number. I did aim for that when it started. We're going to start our test review in the next few classes. Make sure you've gotten these in your notes somewhere. You guys have a great day.